I would rather die than belong to a king." The words fell into the royal hall like a crack through ice, sharp enough to silence 300 wolves in a single breath. Even the silver chandeliers seemed to stop trembling above the obsidian throne as Seraphine Vale stood in the center of the moon court with her chin lifted and her pulse roaring inside her ears. The Alpha King's hand still wrapped around her wrist, warm and impossibly steady, his thumb resting against the place where every Omega in the kingdom dreamed of receiving the royal mark. But Seraphine did not dream about crowns. She dreamed about cages. The scent of cedar smoke and winter frost surrounded Lucien Varick like a living storm, heavy enough to make weaker wolves lower their eyes. Every noblewoman in the room stared at Seraphine with disbelief. Some looked horrified, others jealous, because no Omega in recorded history had ever refused the Alpha King in front of his court, especially not during the choosing ceremony, especially not when Lucien Varick himself had descended from the throne and crossed the marble floor for her. Seraphine could still feel the heat of hundreds of eyes burning into her skin. The silk sleeves of her pale silver dress trembled faintly around her hands, though she forced herself not to pull away from him. Fear was dangerous around alphas. Fear smelled like weakness. And Lucien's wolf was already close enough for her to feel it beneath his skin, vast and ancient, and watching her with terrible focus. Somewhere behind the royal musicians, someone dropped a crystal glass. The sound shattered through the silence. No one moved after that. Lucien's expression remained unreadable. Beautiful. Cold. Carved from something harder than stone. His dark hair brushed the collar of his black ceremonial coat, and the silver crown resting against his head reflected moonlight from the high cathedral windows. He looked less like a king and more like the kind of creature old villages prayed would never step out of the forest. Yet his grip on her wrist never tightened. That frightened Seraphine more than anger would have. "You refuse the royal mark," Lucien said quietly. His voice was low, enough that only the wolves closest to them could hear it, but the power inside it rolled across the hall anyway. Seraphine swallowed carefully. "Yes." Murmurs erupted instantly across the room. Lady Marrow of the Eastern Territories covered her mouth in shock, while several younger alphas exchanged dark looks from the edges of the ballroom. Near the throne steps, the royal advisors looked ready to collapse where they stood. Refusing the mark was more than an insult. It was defiance against the crown itself. But Seraphine could not stop now. Not after what she had seen growing up. Not after watching her mother waste away beneath a royal bond that turned her into a shadow of herself. Not after years of hearing noblemen speak about Omega women as if they were prized horses to be owned and displayed. The royal mark was not love. It was obedience wrapped in gold. Lucien studied her face in silence. Seraphine forced herself to meet his eyes, even though instinct screamed at her to look away. Silver. His eyes were pure silver beneath the chandeliers, cold as winter rivers beneath moonlight. Predatory eyes. Ancient eyes. And for one impossible second, she thought she saw something flicker there beneath the ice. Not rage. Pain. The realization unsettled her so badly, she almost stepped back. "Do you fear me?" Lucien asked. The question was soft, honest enough to feel dangerous. Seraphine's throat tightened, because the truth was complicated. She feared what kings became when they wanted something. She feared what alpha instincts could do to an Omega once possession entered the bond. But standing this close to Lucien Varick, she feared something else too. The way her heartbeat reacted to him. The way her wolf stirred awake for the first time in years whenever his scent wrapped around her lungs. "I fear losing myself," she answered at last. The hall went still again. Lucien's gaze did not leave her face. Somewhere outside the palace walls, thunder rolled across the mountains surrounding Nightthorn Kingdom. Rain tapped softly against the towering stained glass windows overhead. For a long moment, the Alpha King said nothing at all. Then slowly, unbelievably, his hand loosened around her wrist. Gasps rippled through the court. Lucien released her completely. Seraphine stared at him in confusion as he stepped back once, the black fabric of his coat shifting like shadow across the marble floor. Most kings would have punished her immediately. Most alpha rulers would have demanded submission before the entire court. Lucien only watched her with those terrible silver eyes. "Then I will not force you," he said. Several nobles inhaled sharply. One of the royal elders nearly stumbled down the throne steps in shock. But Lucien ignored them all. His focus remained entirely on Seraphine. And somehow that was worse. Because now she understood something terrifying. The Alpha King wanted her willingly. "You may leave the ceremony, Miss Vale," Lucian continued calmly. "No harm will come to you in my kingdom." Seraphine should have felt relieved. Instead, unease curled beneath her ribs. The room suddenly felt colder than before. Around them, whispers spread through the ballroom like wildfire. "Rejected the king. Refused the mark. Mad Omega. Ungrateful girl." But beneath all the whispers, Seraphine could feel one thing stronger than the rest. Lucian's attention. It followed her as she stepped backward across the polished floor. It followed her as the crowd parted in fearful silence. And even when she reached the massive golden doors of the Moon Court, she could still feel the weight of his silver gaze resting against her spine like a promise neither of them understood yet. Behind her, the Alpha King finally turned back toward his throne. But the ancient mark hidden beneath the fabric over his chest had already begun to burn. By midnight, the entire kingdom knew her name. Seraphine could feel it in the way people stared as she crossed the lower market streets beneath the rain. Merchants stopped talking when she passed. Noble carriages slowed beside the sidewalks just long enough for silk curtains to shift and curious eyes to study her face. Somewhere behind her, two young Omegas whispered the words "reckless girl" before hurrying away beneath their umbrellas. Seraphine pulled the hood of her dark wool cloak lower and kept walking. The storm had grown heavier since she left the palace hours earlier. Rainwater ran through the cobblestone streets of Nightthorn City in silver streams, reflecting lantern light like broken mirrors. Usually she loved the city after midnight. It felt quieter then, safer. But tonight the air itself felt tense, as if the kingdom had not yet recovered from what happened inside the Moon Court. Because the Alpha King had chosen an Omega who refused him. And worse than that, he had let her walk away untouched. The memory unsettled her more the longer she thought about it. Seraphine climbed the narrow steps toward the apothecary where she rented a room above the shop, and stopped abruptly when she noticed the flowers. White winter roses rested carefully beside her door. Freshly cut. No note. Her stomach tightened immediately. Those flowers only grew inside the royal greenhouse beyond the northern towers. Slowly, Seraphine looked over her shoulder into the rain-soaked street below. Empty. The wind carried the scent of smoke, wet stone, and distant pine forests through the city. But beneath all of it lingered something colder. Cedar. Frost. Her pulse stumbled painfully. Lucian. Impossible. She told herself she was imagining things, yet the feeling remained, like unseen eyes following her from somewhere beyond the shadows. Seraphine quickly grabbed the flowers and stepped inside, locking the door behind her. The small apartment above the apothecary smelled faintly of dried lavender and old books. A fire crackled softly in the iron stove near the window, casting warm orange light across the worn wooden floors. Normally the room comforted her. Tonight, it only made her feel trapped. She dropped the roses onto the kitchen table as if they might burn her skin. Then she paced. Once, twice, 3 times. Her heartbeat refused to settle. Finally, she stopped before the rain-streaked window overlooking the city. The palace stood high above Nightthorn like a black mountain crowned in silver light. Somewhere inside those towering walls sat Lucian Varick. Calm, controlled, untouchable. Yet Seraphine could not stop remembering the expression in his eyes when she said no. Not fury, not humiliation. Something far more dangerous. Restraint. A soft knock sounded downstairs inside the apothecary. Seraphine froze instantly. Another knock followed. Slower this time. Her wolf stirred uneasily beneath her skin. She crossed the apartment quietly and opened the drawer beside her bed, fingers wrapping around the small silver knife hidden inside. The weapon was ceremonial at best, but it steadied her nerves. The knock came again. Seraphine descended the narrow staircase carefully until she reached the darkened shop below. Shelves of herbs and medicine jars cast long shadows across the room. Rain tapped steadily against the glass windows facing the street. "We are closed," she called softly. Silence answered her. Then a deep voice spoke from the other side of the door. "I know." Every muscle in Seraphine's body went rigid. She knew that voice instantly. Low, controlled, smooth as winter ice over deep water. Lucian. Her pulse crashed against her ribs so hard it almost hurt. For one irrational second, she considered pretending she was not there. But Alpha hearing would never allow that lie to survive. Slowly, Seraphine approached the front entrance. The lantern beside the door illuminated rain sliding down the glass panes. Through them, she could barely make out the tall outline standing beneath the storm outside. One hand rested against a black umbrella. The other remained at his side, waiting, still, like a wolf outside the edge of firelight. "Your Majesty," she whispered before she could stop herself. The shadow beyond the glass shifted slightly. "You left the ceremony without your cloak," Lucien said calmly. "You would have gotten sick walking home in this weather." Seraphine stared in disbelief as he lifted a folded black cloak over one arm. It was hers, the one she had forgotten in the palace. Warmth still lingered faintly inside the fabric. But that was not what frightened her most. What frightened her was the realization that the Alpha King himself had carried it here. Seraphine stared at the cloak in Lucien's hand as rainwater slid from the edge of his umbrella in silver lines. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The storm softened the noise of the city around them until the entire world felt narrowed to the distance between the door and the Alpha King standing outside it. "You came here yourself," she said quietly. Lucien's silver eyes lifted toward hers through the rain-speckled glass. "Would you have preferred I sent servants?" The question carried the faintest trace of amusement, though his expression remained unreadable. Seraphine tightened her grip on the knife hidden behind her back. Kings do not usually walk through storms to return forgotten clothing. Perhaps most kings do not. The answer unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the mountains beyond Nightthorn City. Lucien stood perfectly still beneath the black umbrella, dressed now in a dark wool coat instead of ceremonial armor. Without the crown and throne behind him, he almost looked younger, less untouchable, but the power around him remained impossible to ignore. It pressed against the air itself, ancient and controlled and dangerously calm. Seraphine slowly unlocked the door, but kept it barely open. Cold rain-scented wind swept into the apothecary immediately. Lucien held the cloak toward her without stepping inside. "Thank you," she murmured, reaching for it carefully. The moment her fingers brushed the fabric, warmth spread unexpectedly across her skin. Not from the cloak. From him. Seraphine's breath caught softly. Lucien noticed. Of course he noticed. His gaze sharpened almost instantly, silver eyes lowering briefly toward her trembling hand before returning to her face. Something flickered across his expression, then disappeared too quickly for her to understand. "You are afraid of me," he observed quietly. Seraphine swallowed. "Should I not be?" Rain tapped steadily against the windows behind her. Somewhere upstairs, the old pipes inside the apartment groaned softly with the cold. Lucien remained silent long enough to make her nervous. Then, unexpectedly, he looked away first. "Most people are," he admitted. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Seraphine studied him carefully through the narrow opening of the door. The stories about Lucien Varick painted him as merciless, untouchable, a ruler who ended wars before they started simply by arriving at the battlefield. Yet standing here in the rain outside a tiny apothecary, he did not look cruel. He looked tired. The realization disturbed her deeply. "Why did you choose me?" she asked before she could stop herself. Lucien's eyes lifted back to hers immediately. The storm wind shifted then, carrying his scent through the doorway again. Cedar, frost, wild northern forests beneath snowfall. Seraphine hated the way her pulse reacted to it. "I do not think you want the real answer tonight," Lucien said softly. Her heartbeat stumbled once. "And what does that mean?" For the first time since arriving, Lucien stepped slightly closer to the doorway. Not enough to frighten her. Just enough for the lantern light inside the apothecary to illuminate the sharp lines of his face. Rain clung to the dark strands of his hair. "It means," he said quietly, "that my wolf recognized you long before I allowed myself to." Seraphine's chest tightened painfully. No, she refused to let herself react to words like that. Alpha instincts were dangerous things. Possessive things. They mistook fascination for fate all the time. "Your wolf does not know me," she whispered. Lucien held her gaze for several long seconds. "That is what worries me." The answer left her speechless. Somewhere down the empty street, distant footsteps echoed briefly before disappearing into the rain again. Lucien finally stepped back from the doorway. The movement should have relieved her. Instead, an unexpected ache spread through her chest the farther he moved away. "Good night, Miss Vale," he said calmly. Seraphine hesitated. "Good night, Your Majesty." Lucien inclined his head once. Then he turned and disappeared into the storm-dark street beyond the lantern light. Seraphine remained frozen in the doorway long after he vanished from sight. The cold wind curled around her ankles while rain whispered across the rooftops of Nightthorn City. Slowly, she looked down at the black cloak still clutched in her hands. The fabric carried his scent faintly now. Warm, dangerous, impossible to ignore. And hidden deep beneath the heavy folds near the collar, Seraphine finally noticed the royal crest stitched carefully into the lining by hand. Not by servants, by the king himself. The next morning, Nightthorn City woke beneath a sky the color of steel. Fog drifted low through the narrow streets while church bells echoed softly across the rooftops. Seraphine had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw silver eyes watching her through rain. By sunrise, the black cloak still rested folded carefully beside her bed, untouched. She hated herself for noticing how warm it still smelled. Downstairs, the apothecary was already crowded with customers escaping the cold morning air. Elder Miriam moved between shelves of herbs and medicine bottles with practiced ease, her silver braids swinging softly against her back. The old healer rarely paid attention to court gossip, but today even she seemed distracted. "You have visitors outside," Miriam murmured while crushing dried lavender leaves behind the counter. Seraphine stiffened immediately. "Visitors?" Miriam gave her a pointed look over the rims of her glasses. 3 noble daughters pretending they came to purchase tea. Seraphine exhaled quietly. Of course, news traveled faster than storms in Nightthorn. She glanced carefully through the shop window and immediately spotted them standing across the street beneath fur-lined cloaks. Beautiful, wealthy, watching her like hungry wolves studying wounded prey. One of them smiled faintly when Seraphine noticed them. The expression held no warmth at all. "They have been standing there for almost an hour," Miriam added. "You made dangerous enemies at the palace." Seraphine looked away from the window. "I did not ask for the king's attention. That does not matter anymore." Miriam's voice softened slightly. "Power changes the air around people, child. Especially royal power." Seraphine lowered her gaze toward the herbs spread across the counter. Deep down, she already knew the old woman was right. Since the ceremony, everything felt different. The city no longer looked at her like a forgotten Omega. Now people looked at her as if she carried something explosive beneath her skin. Outside, one of the noble women finally crossed the street toward the shop entrance. Seraphine's wolf stirred uneasily. The bell above the door chimed softly as Lady Celestine Marrow stepped inside wrapped in cream-colored furs and diamonds pale as frost. Her perfume flooded the room instantly. Sweet, sharp, territorial. Miriam wisely disappeared into the storage room without another word. Seraphine straightened slowly behind the counter. "Lady Marrow." Celestine's blue eyes traveled over her with elegant contempt. "So it is true," she murmured. "The king really came to your apartment last night." Seraphine's stomach tightened. "I do not discuss private matters." Celestine laughed softly at that. "Private?" She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Nothing involving Lucien Varick remains private for long." Hearing his first name spoken so casually felt strangely wrong. Seraphine did not understand why. Celestine studied her face carefully, then smiled again, though this time sadness flickered beneath the expression. "You should have accepted the mark," she said quietly. "Do you know how many women would destroy kingdoms for what you threw away?" Seraphine's pulse quickened. "Then why do you sound angry instead of jealous?" For the first time, Celestine's smile disappeared completely. Silence stretched between them while cold wind rattled the front windows of the shop. Finally, the noblewoman looked toward the street outside before speaking again. "Because every woman who gets close to the throne eventually disappears." The words sent ice through Seraphine's chest. Celestine leaned closer across the counter, her voice barely above a whisper now. 3 future queens in 6 years. One died from illness. One vanished before the bond ceremony. One broke her own engagement and fled the kingdom overnight. Seraphine stared at her in shock. She had heard rumors, but never details. Celestine's eyes darkened faintly. "Lucien never chased any of them." "And me?" Seraphine asked carefully. The noblewoman held her gaze for several long seconds. Then quietly, almost reluctantly, she answered, "You are the first woman he ever followed himself." The bell above the door suddenly chimed again before Seraphine could respond. Cold air swept into the apothecary, carrying the scent of cedar and frost with it. Every instinct inside her body reacted instantly. Lucien stood in the doorway dressed entirely in black, snowflakes melting slowly against the shoulders of his coat, while the entire street outside fell silent at the sight of him. The entire apothecary seemed to shrink the moment Lucien stepped inside. Cold winter air followed him through the doorway along with the scent of snow-covered forests and cedar smoke. Outside, conversations across the street stopped instantly. Even the horses pulling nearby carriages grew strangely quiet beneath the Alpha King's presence. Seraphine felt it immediately, that impossible pressure in the air whenever he entered a room. Ancient, controlled, heavy enough to make weaker wolves lower their heads without realizing it. Lady Celestine straightened beside the counter at once, her posture becoming perfectly formal. "Your Majesty," she said carefully. Lucien barely glanced at her. His silver eyes settled on Seraphine instead, calm and unreadable beneath the dim lantern light of the apothecary. "Miss Vale." Her pulse betrayed her immediately. Seraphine hated that. She forced herself to hold his gaze anyway. "Your Majesty." Lucien's eyes lowered briefly toward the black cloak folded over her arm before lifting again. Something faintly softer crossed his expression for half a second. Then it vanished completely. "I see the cloak reached you safely." Seraphine nodded once. "Thank you." Silence stretched between them. Strange silence. Not awkward exactly. Worse, a silence that felt aware of itself. Behind Lucien, snow drifted slowly through the gray morning outside, while townspeople pretended not to stare through the windows. Seraphine became painfully conscious of every small sound in the shop. The crackle of dried herbs shifting overhead. The ticking clock near the stairwell. Her own heartbeat. Lucien finally stepped farther inside, removing his black leather gloves one finger at a time. The movement was slow enough to feel deliberate, dangerous in a way she could not explain. "I came for medicine," he said calmly. Lady Celestine blinked in surprise. So did Seraphine. Kings did not visit apothecaries personally, especially not kings with royal physicians inside the palace. "Medicine," Seraphine repeated carefully. Lucien nodded once. "For sleep." The answer caught her completely off guard. Before she could stop herself, she stared at him more closely. And for the first time, she noticed the shadows beneath his eyes. Faint, barely visible, but there. Lucien Varick looked exhausted. The realization unsettled her deeply. "You cannot sleep?" she asked softly. Lucien held her gaze for a moment too long before answering. "Not recently." Something in the way he said it made warmth creep unexpectedly into Seraphine's chest. Dangerous warmth. The kind she should have crushed immediately. Beside her, Lady Celestine suddenly cleared her throat. "I should leave." Lucien stepped aside instantly without looking at her. The noblewoman moved toward the door, though not before pausing briefly beside Seraphine. "Be careful," she whispered under her breath. Then she disappeared into the snowy street outside. The bell above the door chimed softly behind her. Seraphine exhaled slowly once they were alone. Elder Miriam still had not returned from the storage room. Coward, Seraphine thought silently, though she could not entirely blame the old woman. Lucien removed one of his gloves completely and rested his bare hand lightly against the wooden counter. The movement drew Seraphine's attention immediately. Dark silver markings curved faintly beneath the skin near his wrist before disappearing beneath his sleeve. Her breath caught. Ancient markings. Royal markings. They looked almost burned into him. Lucien noticed where she was staring. His hand closed slowly. "You should not look at that," he said quietly. Seraphine lifted her eyes back to his face. "Why?" For the first time since entering the shop, something unreadable darkened his expression. Not anger. Something closer to regret. "Because," he answered softly, "the royal mark is not as beautiful as your kingdom believes." The words settled heavily between them. Outside, snow continued falling in slow silence across Nightthorn City. Seraphine stared at him carefully. Now, her instincts sharpening. "What does that mean?" Lucien looked toward the front windows instead of answering immediately. Several long seconds passed before he finally spoke again. "It means," he said quietly, "that every bond comes with a price." A sudden sharp pain flashed across his expression so quickly Seraphine almost missed it. Lucien's fingers tightened briefly against the edge of the counter. Then the pain vanished behind perfect control again. But Seraphine had seen it, and somehow that frightened her more than his power ever had. Seraphine could not stop thinking about his hands. All afternoon, while measuring herbs and preparing tinctures beside Elder Miriam, her mind kept returning to the silver markings beneath Lucien's skin and the strange pain that crossed his face when he spoke about the royal mark. Something about it felt wrong. Not the king himself, the silence around him, as if the entire kingdom had agreed never to ask certain questions. Outside, snowfall thickened across Nightthorn City until rooftops disappeared beneath white fog. By evening, lanterns glowed gold through the storm, while crowds hurried through the streets wrapped in heavy winter coats. Seraphine finally left the apothecary after sunset, carrying a basket of supplies against her chest. The cold bit sharply against her cheeks the moment she stepped outside. Her breath curled pale in the air. Usually she enjoyed winter nights. Tonight her instincts refused to settle. She could feel eyes on her again. Not hostile exactly. Watchful. Careful. She turned once while crossing the narrow market square, but found only strangers moving through the snow. A butcher closing his shop. 2 children laughing near a fountain frozen with ice. A royal guard passing on horseback beneath torchlight. No sign of Lucien, yet his scent lingered faintly beneath the wind anyway. Cedar. Frost. Wild northern forests. Seraphine tightened her grip on the basket and walked faster. The royal palace loomed above the city through falling snow, dark and distant against the mountains. She hated how aware of him she had become. Every shadow felt connected to him now. Every silence. Every shift in the air. By the time she reached the lower bridge near Blackwater Street, snow had begun collecting along the edges of her boots. The bridge overlooked the frozen river running beneath Nightthorn City, its black water barely visible through sheets of drifting snow. Seraphine slowed slightly as she crossed it. Then suddenly she heard raised voices ahead. 3 young alphas stood near the far side of the bridge, blocking the path entirely. Wealthy by the look of them. Noble-born. Their expensive coats carried the scent of expensive whiskey and arrogance. One of them noticed her immediately and smiled. Well, he drawled softly. There she is. Seraphine's stomach tightened. She recognized him vaguely from the royal ceremony. Lord Adrian Veilcrest, son of a powerful northern family. Dangerous in the casual way wealthy men often were. Excuse me, she said calmly, attempting to step around them. Adrian moved sideways at once, blocking her path again. The entire kingdom is talking about you, he said. The Omega who humiliated the king. Snow drifted between them in slow silence. Seraphine kept her voice even. I'm trying to go home. One of the other men laughed quietly. Adrian stepped closer instead. Too close. His alpha scent pressed heavier into the cold air around her, sharp with dominance and curiosity. Seraphine's wolf recoiled immediately beneath her skin. You know, Adrian murmured. Most Omegas would have begged for the royal mark. Seraphine forced herself not to step backward. I am not most Omegas. His eyes darkened faintly at that answer. No, he agreed softly. You are far more interesting. Fear brushed cold fingers down her spine. Not because Adrian frightened her. Because she suddenly understood what Lucien meant when he spoke about power changing the air around people. Since refusing the king, men no longer looked at her normally. They looked at her like a challenge. Adrian lifted one hand slowly, as if to touch her face. Seraphine's heartbeat jumped sharply. But before his fingers could reach her, the temperature around the bridge seemed to drop all at once. Silence crashed over the snowfall. Every wolf on the bridge froze instantly. Seraphine smelled cedar and frost a second before she heard the voice behind her. Remove your hand. Quiet words. Calm words. Somehow far more terrifying because of it. Adrian went pale immediately. Slowly, Seraphine turned. Lucien stood at the opposite end of the bridge beneath falling snow, black coat moving softly in the winter wind, while silver eyes locked onto the young alpha with terrible stillness. No royal guards accompanied him. He did not need them. The entire bridge felt frozen beneath his presence alone. Adrian stepped backward at once. Your Majesty, he said hoarsely. Lucien never looked away from him. Did she invite your attention? Adrian swallowed hard. No, then why? Lucien asked softly. Are you standing so close to her? Snow drifted silently across the bridge while nobody answered the king's question. Adrian looked as though he could barely breathe beneath Lucien's stare. The other two young alphas had already stepped backwards several feet, instinct forcing submission into their posture whether they wanted it or not. Seraphine felt it too. That invisible pressure surrounding Lucien whenever his control slipped even slightly. Not rage. Something colder. More dangerous because it remained perfectly restrained. Adrian finally lowered his gaze. I meant no disrespect, Your Majesty. Lucien's expression never changed. And yet she is uncomfortable. The words settled heavily into the frozen air. Seraphine's pulse quickened unexpectedly. Not because of the confrontation. Because Lucien noticed things no one else ever did. He noticed her discomfort before she spoke a single word. Adrian glanced briefly towards Seraphine as though hoping she might save him from the conversation. She remained silent. Slowly, Lucien stepped closer through the falling snow. His black coat shifted softly around his legs, while silver eyes remained fixed on the young alpha. You will leave now, Lucien said quietly. Adrian did not hesitate this time. Yes, Your Majesty. Within seconds, all three men disappeared down the opposite side of the bridge, their footsteps fading quickly into the snowy streets beyond. Silence returned almost immediately afterward. Only the sound of wind moving across the frozen river remained. Seraphine released a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. Lucien turned toward her then, and the full weight of his attention settled over her once again. Somehow that felt even more overwhelming now that they were alone. Are you hurt? He asked. The question startled her. Seraphine shook her head slowly. No. Lucien studied her carefully anyway, as though confirming the answer for himself. Snowflakes melted against the dark strands of his hair, while cold moonlight reflected softly across his silver eyes. Standing this close to him beneath the storm-dark sky felt strangely intimate in a way Seraphine did not trust. You should not walk alone at night anymore, Lucien said at last. Seraphine frowned immediately. Because of them? Because of what you are becoming. The answer sent unease curling through her chest. I am not becoming anything. Lucien's gaze darkened faintly. The kingdom disagrees. Seraphine looked away toward the frozen river beneath the bridge. Black water moved slowly under the ice like something sleeping beneath glass. I never asked for any of this, she whispered. For a moment Lucien said nothing. Then quietly, almost too quietly to hear above the wind, he answered, Neither did I. Seraphine turned back toward him immediately. The exhaustion she noticed earlier still lingered beneath his composure now. Worse than before, perhaps. His skin looked slightly paler beneath the falling snow. Tension tightened along his shoulders as though he carried something painfully heavy beneath the calm exterior. Her eyes drifted unconsciously toward his wrist again, remembering the silver markings beneath his skin. Your hand, she said softly. The markings. What are they? Lucien became very still. The wind shifted between them, carrying frost and cedar through the night air. You ask dangerous questions, Miss Vale, and you avoid honest answers. To her surprise, the faintest trace of amusement touched his mouth at that. Brief. Gone almost instantly. Most people are afraid to challenge me. Most people are not standing on frozen bridges with you at midnight. Silence stretched again. But this silence felt different now. Softer somehow. Lucien's eyes remained on her face with unnerving focus before he finally spoke. The markings are part of the royal bond. Seraphine's chest tightened. The royal mark? Lucien nodded once. It begins long before the ceremony itself. Snow collected slowly along the shoulders of his black coat. Every ruler in my bloodline carries it. And the pain? She asked quietly. Lucien looked away from her for the first time all night, toward the dark palace towering above the city in the distance. His jaw tightened faintly beneath the cold light. That, he said softly, is the part your kingdom does not know about. Something inside Seraphine shifted painfully at the sound of his voice. Not fear. Worse, sympathy. She hated it instantly. Kings did not deserve sympathy, especially not kings powerful enough to command entire kingdoms with a single word. Yet standing beside Lucien beneath the falling snow, Seraphine suddenly realized something terrifying. For all his power, Lucien Varick looked profoundly alone. The wind grew colder around them as midnight bells echoed faintly from the upper city. Seraphine tightened her coat against the snow while Lucien stood beside her at the center of the frozen bridge, silent and motionless beneath the storm-dark sky. She should have left already. Every instinct told her staying near him was dangerous. Yet her feet refused to move. "What happens if the bond fails?" she asked quietly. Lucien's expression changed almost imperceptibly, a shadow crossing silver eyes already heavy with exhaustion. "Why do you want to know?" Seraphine looked down toward the black river moving beneath the ice. "Because no one talks about it." The wind swept snowflakes between them in soft spirals. Lucien remained silent long enough that she thought he would ignore the question completely. Then finally he spoke. "The royal bond was created centuries ago to strengthen the bloodline of the throne." His voice carried calmly across the empty bridge. "At least that is what the kingdom believes." Seraphine looked back at him immediately. "And the truth?" Lucien's jaw tightened slightly. "The truth is far older." Something cold slid through her chest at the sound of those words. Lucien stepped closer to the stone railing overlooking the river below, snow collecting along the dark fabric of his coat. "Long ago," he continued quietly, "the first king of Nightthorn made an agreement with something ancient." Seraphine felt her wolf stir uneasily beneath her skin. "What kind of agreement?" Lucien's silver eyes lowered toward his own bare hand resting against the frozen stone. Faint silver markings glimmered briefly beneath his skin again before fading. "Power in exchange for loyalty," he said softly. "Strength in exchange for blood." Seraphine's breath caught. "That is impossible. Most dangerous things are." The answer came almost bitterly. She stared at him carefully now. "You believe the royal mark is cursed." Lucien did not answer immediately. Snowfall softened around them, while distant palace lights glowed through the storm above the city. Finally, he said, "I know it is." Silence settled heavily between them. Seraphine's heartbeat quickened. Suddenly pieces began falling into place inside her mind. The missing queens. The pain hidden beneath Lucien's composure. The way noble families spoke about the throne with fear disguised as loyalty. "And if you mark someone?" she whispered. Lucien's eyes lifted to hers instantly. Too intense. Too aware. Then the bond begins feeding. Her stomach tightened painfully. Feeding on what? For the first time all night, Lucien looked genuinely reluctant to answer her. "Life," he admitted quietly. Cold fear spread through Seraphine's chest. "My mother." The words barely escaped her throat. Lucien became very still. She suddenly remembered the slow fading sickness that consumed her mother after accepting a royal bond years ago. The weakness, the exhaustion, the way no healer in the kingdom could explain it. Seraphine stepped backward instinctively. Lucien noticed immediately. Pain flickered across his face again before disappearing behind control. "I did not know about your mother until after the ceremony," he said softly. "I would never have chosen you otherwise." "Chosen you?" The words landed somewhere dangerously deep inside her chest. "Then why?" "Still pursue me?" she asked quietly. Snow swirled harder around them now, silver beneath moonlight. Lucien's gaze held hers with terrifying steadiness. "Because my wolf refuses to let you go." Seraphine's pulse stumbled violently. She hated the way those words affected her. Hated the warmth spreading beneath her ribs despite the freezing night air. "That is not enough," she whispered. "No," Lucien agreed softly. "It is not." The honesty in his voice made her chest ache unexpectedly. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then suddenly Lucien's expression tightened sharply. His hand closed against the bridge railing hard enough for frost to crack softly beneath his fingers. Seraphine stepped forward instinctively. "Lucien." The sound of his first name on her lips changed something instantly. Lucien froze completely. His silver eyes lifted toward her with raw intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. Not anger. Not dominance. Something far more dangerous. Hunger wrapped tightly in restraint. The wind died around them. Even the snowfall seemed to pause. Slowly, painfully slowly, Lucien released the railing and stepped backward away from her. "You should go home now," he said quietly. But Seraphine could still see it in his eyes. Fear. Not fear of her. Fear of himself. For 3 days after the bridge, Lucien disappeared. No royal carriages arrived outside the apothecary. No cedar and frost scent lingered beneath the streets at night. No silver-eyed king waited silently in the rain with impossible honesty hidden behind careful control. Nightthorn City returned to normal around Seraphine, but something inside her no longer felt normal at all. She caught herself searching crowded streets for dark coats and silver eyes. She hated that. Worse, She could not stop thinking about the fear she saw in Lucien when she spoke his name. Not fear of rejection, fear of hurting her. On the fourth night, snow fell harder than before. Thick white storms swallowed the upper towers of the royal palace until the kingdom itself seemed buried beneath winter. Seraphine finished closing the apothecary alone after Elder Miriam left early because of the weather. The city outside had already gone quiet beneath the storm when sudden pounding echoed against the front door. Seraphine froze instantly. The pounding came again, urgent this time. She hurried toward the entrance and pulled the door open against the wind. A royal guard stood outside half covered in snow, breathing hard. "Miss Vale," he said quickly, "you must come with me." Cold dread curled through her chest. "What happened?" The guard hesitated only briefly. "The king is ill." 20 minutes later, Seraphine stood inside the royal palace for the first time since refusing the ceremony. The massive corridors of Nightthorn felt colder now than she remembered. Torchlight flickered against black marble walls while servants moved through the halls in frightened silence. Nobody met her eyes as the guard escorted her upward through the northern tower. Fear hung thick in the air. Real fear. By the time they reached the highest level of the palace, Seraphine's pulse was racing. The doors to the royal chamber stood open. Several royal physicians waited outside looking pale and exhausted. One elderly healer stepped forward immediately when she arrived. "He refuses treatment," the man whispered urgently. "But he keeps saying your name." Seraphine's breath caught painfully. Before she could respond, a deep sound echoed from inside the chamber. Not anger, pain. The physicians all lowered their eyes instantly. Seraphine stepped past them before she could change her mind. The royal chamber beyond was enormous, carved from black stone and silver pillars with tall windows overlooking the storm-dark mountains. But she barely noticed any of it. Lucien stood near the far window with one hand braced against the wall beside him, shoulders tense beneath a black shirt partially undone at the collar. Moonlight spilled across him in silver shadows. The markings beneath his skin had spread. Seraphine stopped breathing for a moment. Silver lines glowed faintly beneath his throat, across his arms, disappearing beneath the fabric over his chest like cracks of light beneath ice. Lucien turned at the sound of her footsteps. His silver eyes found hers instantly. Relief crossed his face so quickly it almost broke. Her heart. "You should not be here," he said hoarsely. Seraphine moved closer despite herself. "Neither should you." The room felt strangely warm despite the blizzard outside. Heat rolled off Lucien in waves now, his wolf clearly struggling beneath his control. Yet even like this, he remained painfully careful not to step too close to her. "The bond is worsening," he admitted quietly. "Why?" Lucien looked away toward the storm outside the windows. "Because my wolf has already chosen you." Seraphine's heartbeat shook hard inside her chest. "But I refused. The ceremony does not matter anymore." His voice roughened slightly with exhaustion. "Not to the bond." Fear spread through her slowly. "Then what happens now?" Silence answered first. Then finally Lucien said the words she had dreaded hearing. "Eventually the curse will consume me completely." Seraphine stared at him in disbelief. "And if I accept the mark?" Lucien's jaw tightened immediately. "I will not ask that of you. Because it could kill me." Lucien looked at her then. Really looked at her. Every ounce of restraint and hidden emotion visible beneath those silver eyes. "Because you deserve freedom more than I deserve relief." The words shattered something inside her completely. For days she had tried convincing herself Lucien's obsession came from possession. Alpha instinct. Hunger. But standing here now, Seraphine finally understood the truth. Lucien had been fighting himself from the beginning. Fighting his wolf. Fighting the curse. Fighting every instinct demanding he claim her before the bond destroyed him. And still he chose her freedom over his own survival. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains while snow crashed violently against the palace windows. Slowly, Seraphine crossed the final distance between them. Lucien immediately stiffened. Seraphine. Her name sounded almost like a warning. She ignored it. Carefully, she reached for his hand. The moment their skin touched, silver light flashed softly beneath the markings across his arm. Lucien inhaled sharply, but he did not pull away. Seraphine's pulse raced wildly as warmth spread through her chest, deeper than fear now. Deeper than instinct. "You said every bond comes with a price," she whispered. Lucien's eyes never left hers. "Yes." Seraphine tightened her fingers around his trembling hand. Then maybe, she said softly, the first king was wrong about what love is supposed to cost. For the first time since she met him, the Alpha King looked completely undone.